Use the diagram. Explain how the two proofs are different. Proof 1. Given that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and angle RTQ is congruent to angle RTS, prove that line segment QT is congruent to line segment ST. Proof 2. Given that angle QRT is congruent to angle SRT, and angle RTQ is congruent to angle RTS, prove that line segment QT is congruent to line segment ST. In proof 1, you use AAS congruence theorem to show that triangle QRT is congruent to triangle SRT, and then conclude that line segment QT is congruent to line segment ST. You use the AAS congruence theorem because in the diagram you are given corresponding angles, then sides that are congruent in the corresponding triangles. In proof 2, you use ASA congruence theorem to show that triangle QRT is congruent to triangle SRT, and then conclude that line segment QT is congruent to line segment ST. You use the ASA congruence theorem because in the diagram you are given corresponding angles, sides, then angles that are congruent in the corresponding triangles. Explain how to use the measurements in the diagram to find the distance across the pond. By the vertical angles congruence theorem, angle AED is congruent to angle CEB. Because looking at the diagram, these two angles are vertical angles because their sides form two pairs of opposite rays. And line segment AE is congruent to line segment CE, and line segment DE is congruent to line segment BE because they have the same lengths. By the SAS congruence theorem, triangle AED is congruent to triangle CEB. Thus, line segment AD is congruent to line segment BC because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So BC equals 57 yards. Use the diagram. Write a plan to prove that triangle ADE is congruent to triangle ABE. Use the ASA congruence theorem to prove that triangle ADC is congruent to triangle ABC, because looking at the diagram, you have corresponding angles, sides, and angles that are congruent in the corresponding triangles. Then line segment AD is congruent to line segment AB because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Then use the SAS congruence theorem to prove that triangle ADE is congruent to triangle ABE because you have sides, angles, and sides that are congruent in the corresponding triangles. Write a proof to verify that the construction of the midpoint of a segment is valid. Given that line segment AC is congruent to line segment AD, is congruent to line segment BC, is congruent to line segment BD, prove that M is the midpoint of line segment AB. Begin with the statements and reasons table. Line segment AC is congruent to line segment AD, is congruent to line segment BC, is congruent to line segment BD because this is given information. Line segment CD is congruent to line segment CD because of the reflexive property of congruence. Triangle ACD is congruent to triangle BCD by the SSS congruence theorem, because you have corresponding sides, sides, and then sides that are congruent in the corresponding triangles. Angle ACM is congruent to angle BCM, because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Line segment CM is congruent to line segment CM by the reflexive property of congruence. Then triangle ACM is congruent to triangle BCM by the SAS congruence theorem, because you have corresponding sides, angles, then sides that are congruent of the corresponding triangles. Line segment MA is congruent to line segment MB because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Then M is the midpoint of line segment AB by the definition of midpoint.